Welcome back to the Basics of series. Today we're going to be talking about something that's a little harder to talk about in something resembling a primer. We're going to be talking about hand traps. One of the strangest things to come out of modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a huge aversion to hand traps. A lot of old school players coming back to the game really don't like the fact that hand traps are so prevalent. A lot of times, one of the big things that really steers people away from wanting to play modern Yu-Gi-Oh is the existence of hand traps. Me personally, I really appreciate hand traps and what they've done to the game, how they've allowed it to progress. But in this video, we're going to be talking about a few key hand traps. I can't cover every hand trap in the game in this video. This video would be hours long if I tried to do that. So we're just going to cover a few key ones, go over a few overarching categories of hand traps, and give a brief overview as to why hand traps are extremely important. If we're going to talk about hand traps, then we have to talk about arguably the strongest hand trap in the game, and that's Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring. Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring was originally released in Maximum Crisis, and when it released, it completely changed the landscape of Yu-Gi-Oh! As we know it. This card is one of the strongest singular cards in the game. There are some strategies whose entire game plan crumble under the weight of this one singular zombie girl. The reason why this card is so strong is because of the fact that any effect. The reason why this card is so strong is because the fact that any effect that either adds from deck to hand, summons from deck, or sends from deck to grave can be negated with this card at quick speed. If you open this card in your opening hand and your opponent activates a card that special summons from deck, that adds from deck to hand, or that sends from deck to grave, you can send this card from your hand to the grave or banished. It doesn't need to be sent to grave. This card specifically says discard, and you need to discard this card so it can be activated under things like Macrocosmos, which is another reason why this card is so strong, but I digress. A lot of times, learning a deck and how to play against it boils down to what card should I ash. Ash Blossom is the focal point of talking about competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! So many decks are gatekept out of being good simply because their entire game plan crumbles to a single ash. So many decks want to send from deck to grave, special summon from deck, add from deck to hand. If you time an Ash Blossom correctly, you can completely end a person's turn. And all of that from this one unassuming negation of a single effect. It really is insane just how powerful this one card can be. And even after being reprinted almost a dozen times, this card still fetches a pretty penny. It is, bar none, the strongest hand trap in the game. It does have formats where it's not as good, but even in formats where it's not as good, you can still get huge value off this card. It's so strong. Now, there's an entire category of hand traps that basically do something very similar to what Ash Blossom does, but in a different way. There's the Ghost Girls. This is the other one that I'm going to choose to highlight. There's others that you can take a look at if you're interested. This one is probably the second most powerful Ghost Girl overall. This one, unlike Ash, doesn't have a list of types of effects it can negate. This card says that if an effect is activated, you can discard this card and destroy the card that activated that effect. And in some cases, that can completely ruin somebody's turn. If they normal summon a monster that they intend to use as material for a fusion, a link, a synchro, and you Ghost Ogre it and make it leave the field, suddenly they've lost that key material and they can't continue with their plays. If you Ghost Ogre a continuous spell or a field spell, it actually causes the effect to resolve without any actual effect, meaning that it functionally negates the card. And so many cards have to do an action on resolution of the effect resolving. For example, a modern equivalent would be Gigantic Sprite, which has to detach a material as part of its effect resolution, meaning that if you Ghost Ogre the Gigantic, it can't detach a material, meaning the rest of its effect cannot activate. This card has some extremely powerful but extremely hard to figure out on first glance applications. So often people underestimate just how strong this card is, but it really can put in a lot of work. It pales in comparison to Ash Blossom and Ash's ability to completely end a turn, but Ghost Ogre is equally as powerful when given the correct scenario. Now, other effects activate pretty much the exact same way as Ash. If you play old school Yu-Gi-Oh, they're basically copy and pasting the way that Karibo works, discarding itself from the hand to activate a powerful effect. Ash Blossom negates a certain type of effect. Ghost Ogre destroys a card that activated an effect. DD Crow is probably the next most powerful of the cards that discard themselves to activate an effect. That isn't exactly Effect Veiler. I don't own an Effect Veiler right now, so I can't show it, but we'll just say that Effect Veiler is the third and DD Crow is the fourth. Effect Veiler just discards itself, targets a monster on the field, negates that monster's effects, but it can only be activated during your opponent's turn. It's extremely powerful. It doesn't require the effect to have any sort of specific attributes like Ash Blossom does. So it has a much wider use case in terms of negating monster effects, but Ash can be used to negate spells and traps, so it has a much wider use case in terms of what types of cards it can negate. DD Crow, on the other hand, is actually quite old. This card's been around for quite a while, and it's seen play sporadically throughout Yu-Gi-Oh's history. As long as decks want cards in the graveyard, DD Crow will be around to yoink them out of their graveyard. This card has somewhat been power crept by the Bystials, but the difference between that and the Bystials is that DD Crow can banish any card. It doesn't have to be a monster, and it doesn't have to be dark or light. This card can banish anything from your opponent's grave. But the Bystials can banish from your own grave, meaning you can dodge things like other Bystials or a DD Crow with a Bystial. So, DD Crow does have its applications in its own right that make it better than Bystials in certain scenarios, but there are certain scenarios where Bystials are better than DD Crow. But we're not going to talk about Bystials right now. We're talking about DD Crow. You can see just how strong a card like DD Crow is if you play older Yu-Gi-Oh! Your opponent activates a monster reborn to reborn something from their grave. You DD Crow it, and suddenly they just -1 themselves. Your opponent goes to, send a card to the grave with Foolish Burial that they intend to activate the effect of. Before they have the chance to activate it, you DD Crow. There's also applications with the newer rules around when effects can activate. Basically, they've changed the rules where if a card moves location before its effect would trigger, meaning if a card is sent to the grave, it has an effect when it's sent to the grave, but before the chain resolves that sent it to the grave, it gets removed from the graveyard either by being summoned, shuffled back to the deck, banished, whatever. The effect that triggered when it was sent to the grave doesn't have a chance to trigger, meaning that DD Crow can be used to dodge effects like that. Essentially, this card can be used in an innumerable number of instances. The interactions that come up when you're dealing with DD Crow are insane. So, when talking about these three cards, and arguably Effect Veiler, even though I don't actually own a copy at the moment, you're looking at some of the most powerful singular interactions on your opponent's turn. But there is another card. A card that, unlike Ash Blossom, which negates an effect, and unlike Effect Veiler, which merely negates an effect, also removes the card from the field. And that's Psyframe Gear Gamma. Now, the Psyframe monsters are a series of monsters who all require you to control no monsters on the field in order to activate their powerful effects. There's one that negates spells, one that negates traps, and there's Gamma, which negates monster effects. Now, it needs to summon a Psyframe driver from deck, meaning that you have to play 3 of the Gamma and 1 of the driver. Now, the driver can be summoned from deck, it can be summoned from hand, it can be summoned from grave. So essentially, as long as the driver doesn't end up banished or on the field by some other means, the Gamma is always live. It never feels good to summon the driver from your hand because that, is less cards that you have in your hand. That driver could have been something else. But being able to negate something with Gamma is just worth the off chance that you end up with a dead card in your hand. Now, the reason why Gamma is so strong is, first of all, it's a level 2. It synergizes with Sprite. It's a 2 tuner, and it summons a 6 non-tuner, which means if you activate Gamma on your own turn, you can go into a level 8 synchro. There's a lot of strong level 8 synchros, in case you weren't aware. But the thing that makes this card so worth playing is that it doesn't just negate a monster effect, it destroys the monster. Meaning that if your opponent normal summons a monster, in much the same way that I mentioned with Ghost Ogre, if your opponent normal summons a monster and activates its effect, unlike Ghost Ogre, it doesn't just destroy the monster, it also negates the effect that was being activated. So Gamma basically represents stopping your opponent from activating an effect of a monster that they have on their field, and then removes that monster from the field. Now, one of the things that may not be entirely apparent immediately when looking at Gamma, there's no once per turn on this card. Meaning that if your opponent negates Gamma with something like, I don't know, say an Ash Blossom, because this does summon the driver from deck, so it can be negated with Ash. But if it's negated with an Ash Blossom, it doesn't get destroyed because Ash does not negate and destroy, it merely negates the effect. So you keep the Gamma in hand, meaning you can activate it again later. And there's other hand traps like that. The unfortunate thing is that a lot of them are once per turn. This one is not, meaning that if you're in a situation where, say, your opponent has a monster negate on their field that does not destroy the monster, like, say, Appaloosa, Bow of the Goddess, your opponent has to weigh the cost of negating this card with Appaloosa, knowing that that negate does not remove it from your hand. So if they can't play through Gamma, or if they can't afford to just spend all their Appaloosa negates on your Gamma over and over, then they really have to consider if it's even worth negating, putting your opponent in an extremely difficult position. One of the many reasons why Gamma is such a strong hand trap, and one of the reasons why you play it even though you have to play a dead card in order to make it work. Now, that's the end of the hand traps I want to talk about that just have an effect in your hand. These 3 sending themselves, 4 if you count the effect failure that I don't own a copy of. And then this card summoning itself from the hand. Now, so often hand traps get a bad rap, and a lot of times the hand traps that really cause people distress are specifically Ash Blossom, and then there are another set of hand traps. Now, I could give you many examples, but I'm going to focus on one very specific example, and that's Artifact Lancia. Now, Artifact Lancia is an artifact card, meaning that you can set it in your back row, and it has a lot of the same attributes that, the other artifacts have. Now, Lancia is different because its powerful effect does not activate when it's summoned, like Artifact Scythe does. This card actually can be used as a hand trap, or it can be sent from the field. It's not just a hand trap. And I didn't mention this before, but that's also true of Ghost Ogre, meaning that this card is also a great emergency teleport target to summon it off of emergency teleport to just have as an extra interruption. But back to Lancia. Lancia discards itself or sends itself from a field. And then for the rest of the turn, neither player can banish cards. Now, in the current metagame with Kashtira running rampant, preventing them from being able to banish is a huge benefit, because suddenly they're no longer able to trigger a lot of their very powerful Kashtira effects. And in formats where banishing was extremely prevalent, formats like Orcust format, formats like mostly Orcust format is what I can think of. But this card has been extremely powerful in a myriad of different formats. In the current format, this card sees side deck play. Now, this belongs to a group of hand traps. I can show another example, but the version I have of it is not in English, so it wouldn't really do much good. They are lingering effects that exist on a hand trap. Functionally, what it is functionally, it's a list of cards whose hand trap effect, once you discard it, causes the game to undergo a change. This one makes it where your opponent cannot banish. A card like Dimension Shifter makes it where all cards get banished. A card like Droll Lockbird makes it where neither player can add from deck to hand. So these types of hand traps are one of the biggest points of contention for a lot of players when it comes to hand traps, because cards like Dimension Shifter, cards like Droll Lockbird, cards like Artifact Lancia, they're not just singular interactions that you use a card from your hand in order to, gain a benefit. These are cards that can completely shut down an entire mechanic of the game. And they're what's referred to as floodgate effects. If you know anything about floodgates, you know typically they're continuous traps or continuous spells or monsters that exist on the field that while they're on the field cause an effect to happen. But there are also floodgate effects that are lingering, meaning that once the effect is resolved, there really isn't anything your opponent can do to stop it. It's extremely difficult to interact with unless you have something to interact with it the second that it activates. And that's an extremely frustrating design philosophy when it comes to the way that floodgate hand traps work. But they tend to be some of the most powerful equalizers in the game, and they tend to do an extremely good job of keeping extremely powerful decks in check so that other weaker decks can have a chance to kind of go over the top of them. Is that a reason to keep decks like or cards like this around? I don't know. I don't really have any sort of say in how these cards are designed, but to me, it really depends on how egregious the floodgating effect is. A card like Lancia doesn't shut down an entire mechanic necessarily. It merely limits the way that you can activate effects. And if your deck is built around activating effects that way, then yeah, you're going to have a bad time. But even decks that do want to banish can play through Lancia. So I think that there are arguments both ways as to why these cards are good or bad, but we're not here to talk about whether they're good or bad. We're merely here to give you an idea of what they are, why they're good, and why they see play. So next up, we're going to talk about a type of hand trap that, in a lot of ways, is just extremely busted in a way that hasn't really been explored very much in Yu-Gi-Oh! And that's board wipe hand traps. Now, Nibiru is really the only one that I can think of immediately that has really kind of taken off in any meaningful way. Really, hand traps have never done something like this. Nibiru is functionally a dark hole, but instead of destroying, it tributes. It has a minimum summon requirement, so your opponent has to summon a certain number of times before it can activate its effect. But really, if you're wanting to tribute your opponent's entire field, they're probably summoning a bunch of times anyway, so that really doesn't matter. Plus, it can be activated on your opponent's turn before you even do a single action. And Nibiru is one of those cards that when activated on somebody really can just completely end a person's turn. it can be frustrating to go through the motions, think that, oh, well, I probably lose to Nibiru, but, what are the chances that they drew it? And then suddenly they go end of main and reveal the Nibiru to you, and you realize, oh, I should have done the line of play that played around Nibiru. When Nibiru was printed back in 2019, it completely changed the landscape of Yu-Gi-Oh! And completely changed the way that people deck build. Now, decks can only really compete if they can play through these two cards specifically. Nibiru and Ash so thoroughly changed the way that decks are built. It's unbelievable. Ash made it where now you have to either have an effect that can bait Ash so that you can actually activate your extremely important effect, or you have to just have enough search power and have enough effects that go off in sequence to gain you advantage that a singular Ash doesn't end your entire turn. And so many decks are just cramming ways into their end board in order to play around Nibiru. There are scenarios where people have a line to activate Zeus, and they could go for a 4-material Zeus, which if you know anything about Divine Arsenal AA Zeus, for every 2 materials it has underneath it, it can activate to send all cards on the field to the grave except itself. So often people are choosing to go for a 3-material Zeus instead of a 4-material Zeus so that they cannot lose to Nibiru. If you want to see a great example of that, go check out the game on Nimnim's channel where he does his Master Conquest versus Farfa. In one of the games, Farfa does the play that plays around Nibiru, and Gage has Nibiru in his hand, and it ends up being extremely good in Farfa's favor that he did that. So often decks try to summon Appaloosa on their 5th summon. They try to make a rank 4 to go into something like Rafflesia with a Gravedigger's Trap Hole in deck to play around Nibiru. Adamancipator trying to end on a Kawaki Guardian so that they can play around Nibiru. So often decks will weave and cram and try and finesse lines or boards that play around Nibiru because it is such a powerful hand trap. There are some decks that when they get Nibiru'd, they can just keep going. They can just build a board even after they've been Nibiru'd. But a lot of decks cannot play through Nibiru. In the same way that when Maximum Crisis came out, Ash Blossom started gating decks out of being playable, Nibiru did the exact same thing. Tons of decks that fall or crumble to Nibiru were suddenly just completely unplayable because in game 1, most people don't main deck Nibiru, but in games 2 and 3, if people side in 3 copies of Nibiru, you have something like a 60 to 80% chance that your opponent's just going to draw it in games 2 and 3 and just blow you out of the water. So this card completely changed the landscape of Yu-Gi-Oh! There aren't many other hand traps like it, but there are some hand traps like it, like the brand new one, the Kurikari Divincarnate card, is very similar to this, as is a few other hand traps. But Nibiru is the OG, even though it's only like 4 years old. But it is one of the first and most powerful board wipe hand traps in the game. Arguably the second most powerful hand trap in the game behind Ash Blossom. Now, lastly, I want to talk about hand traps that aren't necessarily interruptions, but offer extremely powerful effects when it is your opponent's turn. The go-to example is Fantastical Dragon Phantasme, known colloquially as Thanos Dragon, because the thing here kind of looks like the Infinity Gauntlet. I don't really see it, but that's what people refer to it as. Phantasme is cool, but this card was much more powerful in Master Rule 4 back when you needed to summon links in order to open up zones to summon Fusion, Synchros, and Xyz. Once they changed the rules where Fusion, Synchros, and Xyz no longer need link points to be summoned from the extra deck, Link monsters fell off in terms of being played in every deck, and Phantasme fell off in terms of being an extremely powerful staple card that was always good. Phantasme, though, is still an extremely powerful card in certain formats where link monsters are everywhere. If there's, say, something like a Verte Anaconda that's played in just about every single deck and is always being used to summon something like DPE, you can always guarantee that when you can summon a Phantasme and at least get a +1 off of it. Now, Phantasme's effect is that when a link monster is summoned, you can draw cards equal to the number of link monsters on the field at the time, +1, and then shuffle cards back into the deck equal to the number of link monsters on the field. So you get to keep one of the cards, but in addition, you don't have to shuffle back the cards you drew. You can shuffle back cards you already had in your hand. The difficulty with this card is that it turns off cards like Gamma. But the shuffle back effect allows you to kind of shuffle back cards that might be dead because of it and try and draw into other cards that aren't dead. It also has an effect where if a card is or a monster is targeted, you can discard a card to negate it. That does come up. It can be used to negate things like Effect Veiler, Infinite Impermanence, stuff like that. But that effect isn't nearly as prevalent. Now, cards like this, cards that are hand traps but don't really offer any sort of real disruption in the immediate, they tend to come in and out of formats. This card's only really good if you can guarantee that your opponent's going to be summoning link monsters, and it becomes better the more link monsters they summon before putting up a monster negate. But cards like it do come up pretty frequently. And so you want to be aware that hand traps exist that aren't exactly interruptions. Sometimes they're just cards that you can activate on your opponent's turn that net you advantage and are worth playing if you can trigger those effects consistently. And that is sort of a very basic rundown of hand traps. I'm going to put 3 different kinds up on the screen so I can kind of give some closing remarks. Hand traps are seen as a very polarizing topic when it comes to Yu-Gi-Oh! I personally think that they're fine. But the big reason why hand traps are seen as a bit of a problem is because a lot of old school players miss the days of setting cards in your back row and the idea of, games lasting a bunch of turns where you set back row, set monsters, summon, activate singular activation removal, so on and so forth. But for me personally, I think that those people are a little reductive. Sure, games don't last nearly as many turns as they used to, but turns have a lot more actions in them than they used to. And the cool thing about the existence of hand traps and the prevalence of hand traps in the metagame is that regardless of at what point in the game we are, regardless of whose turn it is, both players have an opportunity to be playing at all times. Now, it can be frustrating when you don't draw hand traps and your opponent basically has full combo and you have no means of interacting with them, and when it comes around to your turn, you feel like you really don't have an opportunity to play. But I feel like situations like that came up even before hand traps. I feel like there were times where you would brick and draw absolutely 0 cards to get the ball rolling, and you just had to watch as your opponent accrued advantage turn after turn while you kept drawing dead cards. So it really comes down to how you build your deck, how you play out individual, chain links and interactions, and the types of decks that you want to play. Because if you're playing something like a control deck or a stun deck, you can return to the days of games lasting multiple turns. You just have to understand that your opponent's not going to like you, and you just have to be okay with that and accept that. But at the end of the day, hand traps are a part of the game, and they're not really going anywhere. In fact, there's probably going to be more innovations on what hand traps can and can't do and how strong they are allowed to be. So be prepared for the curve on hand trap power to just spike again with the release of a card similarly powered as Nibiru. But until then, that's a basic overview of hand traps. I hope that this gave you a better understanding of what hand traps are and why they're powerful, how to use them, so on, etc. I'll definitely see you guys in the next one. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and have a wonderful day.